Metabolic disease is on the rise all over the world, and it appears there is one main nutrient driving it. Join me as I discuss with Dr. Pran Yoganathan on his second appearance on Hunger Hunt Feast how this nutrient is driving diseases like fatty liver, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, and how we should be eating to avoid them. Thank you for joining me again on another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. With me is Dr. Pran Yoganathan. This is Pran's second time on the podcast. I asked him back to talk about a very important topic, but I wanted to, just for a quick introduction, he is a gastroenterologist in Sydney, Australia, and he takes a very, say, holistic or preventative approach with his patients in trying to keep them out of the hospital, keep them off of the operating table by giving them nutritional advice to steer them in the right direction, basically disease prevention rather than treating illness as his whole practice. So thank you again for coming on. I appreciate your time, Fran.
Pleasure, Zane. It's great to be on with you again.
Well, a common subject, something you and I have slugged it out on social media with other people, not with each other, with other people many times, is this question of a calorie is a calorie, and equating all macronutrients to be somewhat equal. It just depends on how much you eat in the terms of weight gain, weight loss, metabolic disease. And I know you've you've taken your hits with trolls and all sorts of people arguing this, and it's just, and the difficulty of explaining it to patients, because that has been the mantra and what we've been told for so long. I mean, I think you can relate to that with just explaining, what you eat. The quality of your calories has much more of an impact than just the amount. So I think, so I thought this was a good subject to bring up with you, and particularly about fructose. It seems to be a really underestimated nutrient by many people. They think, oh, it's part of sugar. It's high fructose corn syrup. It's or it's in sugar, but they just think of it as the natural sugar. It's got this name of natural sugar. It's in honey. It's in agave nectars and things that don't elevate insulin, so it's thought to be more harmless. So I just wanted to, again, bring you back and talk about this subject, kind of do a little deeper dive, because I know you're very familiar with this problem and dealing with the liver, the gastroenterology, excuse me, messed up that word, gastroenterology. That's where it starts, right? I mean, the absorption of nutrients there. So what have you found to be really the impact of fructose, not so much in terms of fruit, but in terms of its effect with sugar or with large amounts of sweeteners and syrups that are used as replacements for glucose or for sugar in that sense?
No problem, Zane. I mean, to answer your first question with regards to are all calories equal, the simple answer to that is that the whole calorie in, calorie out model kind of collapses under that argument, because it really doesn't take into account the concept of satiety. And I think satiety is a key player in this. I mean, there is no doubt to achieve meaningful weight loss, one has to be in a caloric deficit. There is absolutely no doubt about that. But to achieve a caloric deficit with satiety, that is, I think, the ideal scenario to be in. And we know the various macronutrients have different thermic effects in terms of how much energy the body has to expend to process them, which comes into your, which has an influence on that whole calorie out concept. In addition to that, I think it just, there's so many aspects of satiety that we're still learning, which is that we understand that by far the most satiating macronutrient is protein, and has many effects on leptin, ghrelin, neurocortical pathways. So, and I've often made the point that a high protein diet is essentially a caloric deficit. But as with anything, you can still put on weight on a high protein diet if you go above what is required. I mean, I think people can still overeat protein, gain weight on it. It's not a panacea for weight loss. For the vast majority of people, they'll find they'll struggle to overeat protein. But for those that make a concerted effort to overeat protein, I think they can still gain weight on that. And there are definitely some inter-individual differences there, I think. So, I think that whole calorie in, calorie out model really doesn't take into account some of the more complex factors. With regards to fructose, well, that's a very topical subject, extremely topical subject. And it's always been portrayed by media and by nutritional guidelines as the natural sugar. And that's kind of allowed us to sort of not feel as guilty, I think, when consuming it. But we know now that it has some very complicated effects on the human body, things that even someone such as myself, who's supposedly trained in the art of fatty liver disease, I'm still come to grips with how it all works and how it impacts human health. There's a paucity of good quality data out there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, leptin is probably one of the, it's a satiety hormone, and it appears that fructose's impact in the liver actually blunts our ability to see the leptin, blocks the brain's ability to see the leptin. So because it elevates insulin through insulin resistance, not through insulin transporting it through our system like glucose does, not taking it to muscles and actually satisfying something. It just creates an insulin response in the liver through insulin, just interrupting the insulin receptors. So, and then so that blocking leptin would keep us from feeling satisfied, would allow us to stay hungry. And then I think it down regulates our energy as well. Like we basically feel lethargic and hungry, which is, I mean, talk about a terrible combination for stimulating weight gain and all sorts of other problems. So
absolutely. And I think it's important, like those are brilliant points you brought up, Zane. I think it's important to distinguish a few things. And I think, we're in this environment at the moment where we've got all these tribes, I suppose, with the carnivore camp, with the vegan camps, fruitarian camps, and and it's a highly confusing environment. And I think, personally, my perspective has always been that fruit in itself is very unlikely to be the issue in of itself. We find that the fruit, whilst it contains a lot of fructose, a lot of it's sort of bound away into this fibrous matrix. And we know fiber has a satiating effect. We know the release when sugar is trapped within a fibrous matrix is slower within the gut. A lot of that fructose may not even make it into the liver, as the fiber generally drags it down into the lower colon, where it's then subsequently fermented.
Right.
So fruit in itself is, I think, very unlikely to be the issue, because it's very difficult to overeat fruit. I think I made the point before, one can of Coca-Cola or soda, to achieve the same amount of fructose loading, you need to eat something like 5 bananas, you need to eat 6 apples, you need to eat 100 cherries. So it's very, very difficult to do that. And kind of the benefit of fruit is that it comes with the fiber. Not that fiber is an essential nutrient, but it at least has some effect on the satiety component for us. I mean, we don't quite understand how fiber satiates. Some people think it's through a ketone pathway, other people think it's through bulk. But fruit in itself is unlikely to be the issue. I think the issue at hand really is the highly refined fructose, where the fructose essentially has been extracted from that fibrous matrix and dumped into a fluid form and delivered to the gut in large amounts.
Right. So it could be juice or soda then, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or these syrups that you mentioned before, the agave syrups and so forth, which classically, even the dietitians and nutritionists have been guilty of that as well. This is a natural sugar. Here it is.
Right.
I think that's kind of what's led to a lot of issues, because we have associated natural with being healthy. Well, we know that's not the case.
Right. Well, it has a no effect on glycemic load. So it doesn't stimulate insulin, fructose in and of itself. Now, in sugar form, obviously the glucose with it is stimulating insulin, but in and of itself, like those syrups, as a nutritionist would recommend, they're supposedly don't elevate insulin, so they're safe. But
Yes.
as you know, I mean, maybe just could go into a little bit of the digestion of, or the metabolism of fructose. It's all in the liver, right? I mean,
Yeah.
nothing goes to the muscles; it all goes to the liver.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, without getting too granular about it,
Mm-hmm.
fructose, if it in its pure form, or even in fruit, if it's delivered to the gut, the way it works is the enterocytes absorb it through a receptor from memory. I think it's a GLUT5 receptor.
Mm-hmm.
Through that receptor, fructose is absorbed directly by the portal vein into the liver. There is no other tissue that can utilize fructose.
Right.
So eat a bar of chocolate or a lolly, which is very rich in glucose. You'll generally get a kick up in your blood glucose, and you'll feel it. You'll feel that buzz in your brain. That's because the brain's taking up the sugar, it's utilizing it. The skeletal muscle utilizes it. But in the context of fructose, you generally won't feel that buzz. It delivers a great deal of pleasure because it's a very, very, very sweet carbohydrate. It's the sweetest carbohydrate that we know, and we can touch on that a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
So here you've got this deeply hedonistic sugar, which can only be utilized by the liver. Now, when you consider our skeletal muscle and our brain and so forth, we're talking about kilograms of tissue that can utilize glucose. But
Right.
now we've got a situation where the fructose can only be utilized by an organ that's 2.5 kilograms, which is the liver. Now, take the most of the modern world, Zane. This liver is packed out with glycogen and fat.
Yes.
Yeah, and so what is the fate of that fructose within the liver? Well, more fat.
Yeah. Converted to fat. That's what I think a lot of people don't understand, is that it's pretty much in the process is turned into fat pretty
Yes.
much immediately, because the glycogen is already full. Or if it comes in the form of sugar, 20% of that glucose is going to the liver, as well as all the fructose. So there's more going to the liver of what you eat than going to the entire rest of your entire body as far as sugar goes.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was, and we talked, and I've done a post on this. There's a Roman chap, the name escapes me, but he figured out a way to essentially change the flavor of a pig liver, and they do the same with foie de gras with geese. You essentially have to force feed fructose, so prunes and you can feed them wines, which ethanol, which is very similar to fructose, and you essentially pack the liver out full of fat. Now, when you consider the liver's a critical organ in terms of insulin sensitivity, because a high glycemic load, which is delivered to your system, like bread or pasta or whatever, your liver has to take up that glycogen. Now, if the liver's already full, well, that's insulin resistance, in its genesis, essentially. So, well, if the liver's full, the body has to find a place to pack that carbohydrate somewhere else, that glycogen somewhere else, and often our glycogen stores are full. So again, that ingested rice or pasta has to convert to triglyceride and then be stored in peripheral tissues, which is around the heart, around the muscle, marbling through the muscle, in the face. And that's kind of at the core of what's going on. It's not a simple one-step system. It's a multifaceted, multi-layered problem, which really is difficult for the layperson to wrap their mind around. But the damage is coming at multiple different levels. Yeah.
Right. So more triglycerides. So people realize triglycerides are a fat molecule, and if you get a lipid profile, you're going to see triglycerides on there with your LDL and HDL and all that. And the triglycerides are actually moved in an LDL molecule called VLDL. So it's like they can actually raise your total cholesterol number because you're eating more sugar that's turned into fat in the liver. And so the liver can get rid of it, pumped out because it can't travel through these triglycerides can't travel through the bloodstream by themselves. They're packaged in the LDL along with the cholesterol and shuttled to, like you said, visceral fat. That's where we got all the visceral fat that people are struggling with now, where you have, and it's around the organs, the kidneys, the pancreas, the heart, as well as muscular tissue, creating insulin resistance there in the muscular tissue as they get packed with fat. But I mean, the real hormonal impact or health impact seems to be the visceral fat, where you have all this fat being packed in around these organs, causing organ dysfunction, from kidney disease, pancreatic disease, or even diabetes, where you have beta cells are just full of fat, kidney disease, so and it's all from sugar. It's not from eggs and steak. It's from it's from an abundance of sugar, and our bodies don't. The best way it knows how to store energy is to store fat. It can only hold so much sugar, and I think that's the thing with the liver. It only holds about 100 grams of sugar or so, which is nothing. I mean, a can of Coke is 40 if it's a little can, if it's a 12 ounce, So if you're having a meal with that, the liver's maxed out, and it's like, where do I do with this? I got to store it as fat and send it everywhere. I think 40% of the U.S. adults have some form of fatty liver. I think is the
It's 40% underdiagnosed, actually.
Right.
Fatty liver is probably under-recognized, but you're right, Zane. I mean, I think you elegantly described it there. And the definition of diabetes is the inability to clear glucose from your circulation within a couple of hours. And so, in essence, you've got a system that's packed out insulin that is very high levels, trying to store as much of this ingested energy. And there is just no storage. There is nowhere to put this glucose. There's no organ system, so it remains within the circulation. And then it glycates tissues. So endothelial cells, which are the cells that line your arteries, become lined with glucose. And now these VLDL, or these LDL molecules, which are now circulating around, they oxidize in the setting of this type of glycated in the setting of glycation. So the LDL themselves become atherogenic or more prone to causing plaque within arteries through the combination of a very high LDL count in addition to glycated tissue. It's just a really bad combination.
Right. Well, I think we're meant to have that much fructose in our bodies. Glucose we're meant to deal with. Glucose, if we don't have enough, we'll create it.
Yes.
Fructose, on the other hand, creates a very different problem. And if you're taking in the same amount of fructose as you are glucose, you don't have a mechanism for that. We don't have a pathway meant to deal with that much.
No, we don't.
And like you said, the glycation. So what I saw in the fructose, process or pathway through the liver is that it creates the reactive oxygen species, the ROS. So creating that, what you said, the cross-linking of proteins, the glycation issue, which is disrupting insulin receptors in the liver, but also as it gets through the endothelial, you're creating inflammation. Essentially, it creates inflammation, and those it makes things sticky, essentially. Absolutely. And the sticky parts is what's causing the plaque to build up and causing inflammation. So just to kind of break that down a bit, it's unbelievable how we've been really blaming the wrong nutrient for 50 plus years.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of I'm unpacking this, seeing stories about like how this came to be, and it's kind of shocking. I'm sure people are wondering why have we been blaming fat for so long when the culprit has been sugar,
Absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge as well, Zane, like with these high fructose loads that we're delivering to our systems, the sodas and the orange juices and things like that, we're also generally concurrently delivering a high fat and a high carbohydrate load as well. So
Right.
it's just a multi-pronged attack. And the issue with fat, and sometimes this is lost in the low carb communities, is that it in itself, unless you've got the energy or the activity to be able to burn it, it too has to store.
Right.
It too has to store. So you've got this situation where the insulin is up. In addition, there's a high fat load within the system in addition to carbohydrate and fructose. All of that has to store. It's a really bad combination. I think the success of the low carbohydrate diets occurs because a lot of fructose and carbohydrate is eliminated, and you're essentially on a diet that is rich in fat and concurrently often rich in protein. So you've got very high levels of satiety, and there comes back that key word, satiety again, because that will automatically allow you to go into a calorie deficit,
Right.
burn more energy than you are consuming.
Right. Something, I mean, you've pointed out a lot on social media is with the fructose, the use of fructose by animals. So we look at the animal kingdom, they use it for migrating. For birds will eat a lot of fruit or nectar before they have to fly somewhere. They'll fatten up. Bears hibernate. If it's a dry season, like monkeys they'll overeat fruit, build up fat. They get fatty liver just like we do. They get some insulin resistance. They put on fat. I think hummingbirds become the fattiest liver, or become like 40% fat. They're just obese. But then they'll fly 400 miles without nonstop. Or a bear will sleep for 6 months without eating and not move. And so they figured out animals, they'll fatten up, but then what's their solution? They fast, or they move without eating. They have this fasted workout that's 400 miles, 500 miles of nonstop flying. And I think therein's our solution. How do you reverse fatty liver disease? How do you reverse insulin resistance and obesity? Well, they do it every year, sometimes twice a year, as they fly from north to south, south to north. It's a, fasting, eliminate calories, move while in a calorie deficit, creating basically they're completely in a deficit. But whereas humans, we just keep eating because food's on every corner.
Absolutely. And we've got food out of season now where there's kind of these highly
what's a season?
That's right. It's foods that have been selected to be extremely sweet, like our fruits now. Modern day fruits are not what they used to be, and so we've got high fruits that are very rich in fructose and reduced in phytonutrients just because of the modern farming techniques, which is bred for maximum profit, obviously. In addition, we've got the sodas, the syrups, the honeys. It's multifaceted, multi-layered, and the attack is coming from many angles. Excellent point you make about our primate cousins. I mean, all primates carry this mutation. I think it occurred about 8 million years ago, which is the primate rasburicase inactivation, which really allows us to amplify the amount of fat that we hold in our system. But concurrently, we push up something called uric acid. So what occurs is with fructose, when it's in the liver being phosphorylated by fructokinase, you actually have to consume energy. You have to consume ATP. So which then upregulates your purine synthesis. So if purine's going up, generally uric acid will go up concurrently. And this is the prevalence of gout. A lot of gout's being really, it's being pushed up by purine-rich foods, whilst fructose doesn't necessarily directly relate to purine. What it does is it creates a load, an increased load within the liver, which then upregulates purine synthesis and really drives up uric acid. And uric acid's linked to a lot of things, not just gout, but cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and it's a real issue. Primates, including us humans, we tend to have uric acid levels which are about 10 times higher than our mammal cousins. So it just shows that mutation really has rendered us susceptible to the modern day environment. Now, historically, pre-agriculture perhaps, or even a few thousand years ago, where we had the activity to burn off a few hundred years ago, even before the advent of the Industrial Revolution, all that stored fat was utilized, but we rarely do this in this modern era.
Right, right. Well, uric acid, that's tied, I think, directly to hypertension as well. I think it really.
Yes, absolutely. All those diseases on that spectrum of metabolic syndrome,
Yeah.
obesity, hypertension,
I
heart
think
disease, the whole lot.
reduces nitric oxide, I think, in the system. So
Yes,
you don't have the
yeah,
expansion of the blood vessels. So, and the other thing that I read that causes, the only other parallel with uric that creates that uric acid like that is brewer's yeast. And
yeah,
so brewer's
yeah,
yeast, not so much alcohol, but just the yeast. So beer, we get the
yes,
beer belly.
yeah,
And now, from brewers, from creating the uric acid byproduct. And
yes,
if you think about, okay, let's think about soda belly, sugar
yeah,
belly, you
yeah,
get this, it's the visceral fat building up under the muscle
yeah,
and around our organs. And so
yeah,
it's the metabolic disease. It's something that's, like you said, it consumes ATP. So we actually have less energy, available energy being produced, more fat, and a buildup of this uric acid byproduct. It's a recipe for metabolic disease and low energy. So,
absolutely, absolutely, yeah,
wow, wow. So under estimated in that it's in every processed food. So like in America, I know it's very similar in Australia. Uh, 70% of our diet on average comes from processed food,
hmm.
and sugar's in 80% of the processed food. Main ingredients of processed food is sugar, refined grains, and seed oils, or canola, all the vegetable oils. The three main ingredients in processed food. And
Hmm.
so between, you get refined grains, you get the sugar, the fructose, but the sugar in there, and then you throw in the omega-6 fats.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh, it's a
hmm.
chemistry set for disease,
Absolutely,
and it's
absolutely.
70% of our diet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In America, yeah, as you said, 70 to 75%, and it kind of shows why North America, particularly United States of America, has really been struck hard in terms of
Yeah,
this obesity and diabetes pandemic, essentially. But there are a lot of other countries not too far behind. The developing nations, certainly India, China, and even the developed nations such as Australia, we're fast catching up
yeah,
as these highly refined foods really take hold, and they're encouraged by our nutritional guidelines. And sadly, they're addictive. They're extremely addictive. And the makers of these foods know this. They know the recipe to cause addiction. And we know that fructose is an extremely sweet sugar. I mean, take a chocolate bar, for instance. It's composed of sucrose. And sucrose is essentially a disaccharide, which is made up of glucose and fructose. If the chocolate bar was composed purely of glucose, it just wouldn't be sweet. So take something like rice or pasta, for instance, that's glucose. That's what
right,
starch is. It's multiple molecules of glucose. And pasta, whilst pleasurable, will not deliver the same amount of pleasure as a chocolate bar will. And that is the difference. That is the power of fructose. It really activates these cortical pathways, and it gives us a dopamine hit. And that's and this is what they've managed to work their way into things like cereals, into juices, into these sweets, and unfortunately they target the children. And from a very early age, these children are basically habituated to these and then become deeply addicted. And now culturally, from our perspective in the modern day world, we link the sweetness with celebrations, and you've got birthday parties where it's all about the sugar. It's just all
right.
about the sugar, and you've got these kids running around just high off their heads. And at some point, if one can take a big picture view or zoom out and have a look at it, it's essentially a drug that we're delivering to these children. And so I think it really sets us up really poorly for the future, because as these obese children and these unwell children grow up to be adults, they've spent more of their life being metabolically unwell, than the modern day adult has. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the modern day adult sort of hits 20, 30, and then it's kind of downhill from there.
Right.
Some of these children now are obese from the ages of 3 and 4. And that's by
Oh
the
yeah.
time they're 34-year-old adult, that's 30 years of obesity.
Right. We have obese six-month olds. So when someone says calories in, calories out, eat less, move more, how's a 6-month-old going to eat less and move more?
Yeah,
And so something has changed in our diet and what we're eating ourselves and our kids in order to create this phenomenon that we've never seen before. We couldn't have survived like this a few hundred years ago. Even we wouldn't have been able to manage it. But because it's like you said, it's our diet has changed, and obese infants, obese toddlers who typically don't stop moving. Between 2 and 5, kids don't stop moving unless they're sleeping. You know what I mean? They're growing, and they're growing. They should be able to consume more calories than anybody as far as in compared to their weight. And yet they're obese because something hormonal is being triggered to tell them to store fat and to keep eating. And at some point, once they become obese kids don't run in circles.
No, 100%, 100%.
So that's a hormonal thing of shut things down. Like you're still hungry, don't move. That's leptin right there, leptin blocking,
Yeah. And there was an elegant paper written in the Journal of Obesity in 2019. It was essentially that they looked specifically at the United States of America, but again, it relates back to this hypothesis that I always talk about, which is protein leverage hypothesis, which is that you deprive someone of protein, which is what is unfortunately occurring in the States now. I think the amount of protein consumed in the American diet is less than 15%. I think it's under some instances under 12%, which is extremely low. So you're in this environment where you're protein deprived, chronically craving energy, but then you're surrounded by energy-rich foods. It really is a recipe for disaster, and that you can pretty much link it back to that. Now, you'll find that if these children, these obese children, where their macro intake of protein starts approaching 30 to 35 to 40%, that's how you will see reversal of this obesity. It'll kill that hedonistic appeal of food, but it's very difficult to do once these kids are hooked to these sugar-rich foods. It's very difficult to reverse that.
Yeah, like you mentioned the dopamine. I mean, that is when people say sugar is addictive as cocaine or something like that. People don't understand that it's hitting the same receptor. The dopamine receptor is addiction. It is not particular to the input. It is just you hit dopamine, you've excited it, and the more you hit it, the more it downregulates, and the more stimulus you need each time to try to get that high. So you've got, and especially with food, you've got varying levels of sweetness.
Yes.
So that variation also is kind of like when you have an alternating stimulus, then you're after that one wasn't good enough. Let me get the next bite will be sweeter. So you have this, really, it's like you said with the food companies, they're set it up to be addictive, not only from the sensation, but hitting the dopamine. It's, you're constantly looking for that next hit of dopamine. It's not like serotonin where you just kind of feel good and content. So whether it could be winning, it could be sex, it could be jumping out of an airplane, it could be, something. It's all cocaine. It's all hitting the same dopamine receptors, and you become trained to associate that with how to get that high is from the food. Yes. It's like you immediately associate that with the donut, the cereal, the soda, whatever it is, the ice cream. It's a trigger, and it's chemical, and you're not conscious of it, but your body knows how to get it.
Absolutely. It's we're very much this Stone Age body, and constantly craving energy because we've evolved in a situation where energy was scarce and treasured and prized. So the body can't switch that instinct off in this modern environment. And so it's really important to educate people, I think, in particular with regard to childhood obesity, educate the parents with how to do it. But to reverse it, it really requires a staged intervention on these children, and it may even involve an element of psychotherapy to help them out of this, because they will resist it, they will fight it, and because that's all they've ever known. So I think this issue of childhood obesity is very, very deeply tied in with fructose. And to reiterate, it's not the fructose from fruit, it's everything else. I'm sure once you're at a point where you're consuming highly refined fructose-based products, fruit no longer helps either, because that's just yet another load added on.
Right. No, I think the estimate is it's somewhere in a 20-25% of a lot of kids' calories are coming from sugar. So half of that sugar is fructose, obviously, or more. If it's high fructose corn syrup, which is probably used more than regular sugar, you got a 55. And in some cases they're saying there's some high fructose corn syrup that is 65% fructose. 25%. So I've seen, read the experiments where they replace some of that fructose with glucose, reduce the fructose down to say 4% of their diet. The rest, the other 25, not changing anything else, same protein, same fat, same number of calories. They're just replace a large amount of the fructose with glucose, and their fatty liver begins to be reduced. Their triglycerides go down. Insulin sensitivity starts to come in a matter of weeks, like just not years, weeks. And it's become clear that, this is the driving force behind our metabolic disease, which, let's face it, it's 75% of the medical costs in the United States is, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, PCOS, hypertension, dementia. That's 75% of our medical costs. If something's going to take down our medical system, it's metabolic disease.
100%.
I think diabetes is 327 billion last I saw, going up 25% every 5 years. What? It's going to be 500 billion within a decade.
It is interesting. I mean, I go to these meetings, these gastroenterology and liver meetings and so forth, and I sit there and I watch my colleagues discuss the treatment paradigms for fatty liver, and they talk about a drug-based approach and an exciting new drug in the horizon, which will help treat fatty liver. Some of these drugs are tens of thousands of dollars per year to run. And when you consider the prevalence of fatty liver, I mean, it's sort of the real solution is nutrition, isn't it? It's nutrition and exercise that lies at the heart of the treatment paradigm. But the medical industry, you've probably seen it in a lot of my blogs and posts. I'm very cynical about it because it is this drug-based approach, and it's very difficult for them to see beyond it. But we've got a job to do in healthcare to change that. I think it's going to take a lot of work. Hard to do though when most of our healthcare system is also overweight and obese. So it's clear that we in ourselves as doctors and nurses and health professionals are not well. So it's going to require some work, a lot of work.
Well, there's the money behind it as well, between whether you're driving pharmaceuticals or driving food. In the United States, I mean, the contract side, I'm sure that it's the same there, for the schools, the hospitals, the prisons, the military. The contracts are in place from the big processed food companies. And then you have campaigns from the sugar industry, soda industry, saying a calorie is a calorie, or, it's no different. Just manage your calories, move more. They actually had created some sort of network they're trying to create. I think it fell flat, of, talking about movement, more moving, so that calories don't, so just about the number of calories, and the type, the quality doesn't matter, is what they're trying to underplay. And so I think that's been the message for 45, 50 years, that it's lower fat, and sugar was fine. At one point, the American Heart Association was telling people, eat candies, marmalades, honey, sugar, crackers, cookies, to replace fat. So you're not eating. That was a message in the 80s.
I mean, that essentially started off the epidemic that we see now.
Yeah.
And I've always made the point that the trick's not the fat, but by following a low-fat diet, what you're essentially doing is you're cutting out the protein because you're concerned about the fat in protein, and that's the real killer. But that is the forgotten macronutrient, Zane.
Right.
You know, so you get in the low-carb communities, we talk about a high fat intake, dropping carbs. And whilst I support that because the carbohydrate insulin model is definitely a real thing. I mean, you're talking about essentially stimulating storage when every time insulin's kicked up, and I agree, fat in itself won't kick up insulin. What we find is overeating fat will still lead to fat accumulation, which will lead to inflammation. Eventually, it will lead to insulin resistance. So really, it's not about the fat or the carbohydrate. Really, what these low-fat guidelines did is they deterred people from eating saturated fat found in protein. So the eggs were forgotten, the red meat was reduced,
Right.
chicken intake went up, which is, that's a discussion for another day, but, you know, that's a long one, big topic. But in essence, what we saw was protein dilution in these dietary guidelines. And the thing with places like Australia, whilst we don't have, as to the degree that you guys have, the influences of these food companies influencing health guidelines and whatnot, we tend to follow the American guidelines. Our pyramid is no different to yours. So, you know, and this is the issue. I think we're on the same trajectory as you guys are.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, there was an articles came out about 5 years ago. They showed letters from a sugar foundation. So it was a sugar promotion foundation to back and forth between them and some Harvard researchers. So chair of the Harvard nutrition department and a couple of the researchers, they paid them to write research papers because what they found I guess it started in the 50s, the Sugar Foundation realized if we can put the blame, because there was some research pushing or showing that heart disease was driven by sugar, even at that time. And they said, this is going to hurt our industry. If we can put the blame on fat, promote a low fat diet, then we can raise the sugar in consumption by 30%.
Yes.
This was their exact thought process. So they actually paid chair of the nutrition department of Harvard and a couple of the researchers to write reviews over this research that's coming out, basically discrediting the people saying sugar is causing it and lifting up the people saying fat is causing it and validating those. This is in the 60s, and this is back when they didn't have to disclose research money or money that they had funding.
Yes.
So they paid them like 50, the equivalent of be 50 grand, which doesn't sound like much to me to sell your soul to the sugar industry, but, but back then it was like $6,500 or, $7,000 a piece or something like that to write these papers. And they actually had dialogue back and forth, letting the sugar industry read the reviews before it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Yeah.
One of those guys ended up working for the USDA and was integral part in creating the nutritional guidelines with the senators that wrote that pyramid. We had a bunch of politicians writing it. That screwed it up right there. But he was the primary guy at the USDA who was advising the people who created the food pyramid. And of course, he's got Harvard behind him. He's on the USDA board. He's back and forth sitting on the board with the Sugar Foundation and USDA. So it's money. I mean, to me, that is infuriating because what their downstream effect of what they've done, it has created this 40 or 50 year health crisis of promoting, using their authority to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's tragic that we still have these same nutritional guidelines, and this is what's being pushed out by 99% of our dietitians. It's the food that is fed to our patients in hospitals. I mean, you should see the food that is served up to patients that are recovering from surgeries or coming in with illnesses. It's the cereals, it's the low-fat milks, it's the fruit juices, it's the sandwiches, and a tiny tiny portion of protein at nighttime. And there's this elderly sarcopenic patients that essentially need protein to recover. So it's sad, but the realist in me sort of starts then thinking about the costs. Well, is the limiting factor? Does this food pyramid essentially protect these institutions against essentially a rising cost? Because you can imagine the cost to give a person a high protein diet in a place like a hospital, in a rehab ward, or whatever it is, would be considerably higher. But then at the end of the day, you would have a well person who is less likely to impact the health system again. So it's kind of the circular argument, but
well, the cost of diabetes alone is $350 billion. How much meat can you buy with that $350 billion?
That's exactly right. So that this comes back to that argument that we're just better off keeping people out of hospitals in the first place with adequate nutrition. It would certainly cost the health system a lot less, but then there'll be less profits being generated for the pharmaceutical companies, which unfortunately they've infiltrated every aspect of the healthcare industry, and their influence permeates research. Now we know that the vast majority of research now is funded by pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical companies, and these studies are geared from the start to work in favor of the drug. And a lot of these studies, you can't, if they were to be done again in a different environment, you can't reproduce the results on that drug. It just shows that there's no if you can't reproduce results, that the drug in itself is questionable. And so we've really got unfortunately, it's exhausting to think about it, but we've really got a messed up system that's geared to let us down. And this is where the internet has been integral in terms of, people like yourselves and being able to educate people. And I think people fundamentally feel deep down that there's something wrong, that there's something wrong with this, not just the nutritional guidelines, but the health system and this whole model. And I think they're questioning it more, which is brilliant, which is good. And they're incentivized to do their own research, and it's slowly educating them. And we're getting people now that understand cholesterol profiles better than their family doctors.
Right.
Which is a sad reflection of our industry.
Yeah, well, if they haven't looked into nutrition since med school, they're not going to understand it. I mean, because I know you guys really don't get much, a semester, and get a couple hours of nutrition maybe, and it's usually twisted. It's wrong anyway, and then the rest of it comes from statin people, salespeople, basically coming around, medical salespeople who are.
It was very much the low-fat food pyramid message delivered to us, and protein causes cancer and so forth. So it's really been a bit of an eye-opener for me to explore this world for the last few years, and I'm learning every time. I'm learning every day with this field, and it's an exciting area because it's preventative healthcare.
It is. It's amazing. I'm thankful for doctors like you who have dug deeper and realized this wasn't working. What do we need to do now, instead of staying in the same hamster wheel of sick care? And for starters, changing your own lifestyle, and then helping your patients, despite the fact that you catch heat for it from coworkers, medical boards. This is not it's not like you guys got your medical degree and you can do carte blanche, whatever you feel like, without things, coming back at you. You can't just say, hey, let's flip this food pyramid upside down and have you eating this way without getting some sort of heat from your medical boards. Fetke, right? He's that was like a major upheaval in Australia. It nearly ruined his career, his life, and it was a campaign. It was a grassroots campaign that really saved him and really got the message out about the food pyramid is wrong. If someone's paying attention, they're going to see, okay. But it was a freedom for a doctor to go outside of the guidelines.
Yes.
I think that's what the argument was about more than anything else. It became about the freedom of that doctor, or doctors to recommend things recommend a nutritional plan outside of the guidelines. And people here, I mean, it's the same thing here. If the doc is within a practice where the practice doesn't want to rock the boat, the doctor's pressured to stay in line with the nutrition.
Absolutely.
They'd have to have their own practice in order to be able to.
Absolutely. It has made me somewhat of a pariah within my own colleagues. I think most of my colleagues are curious about it and they're keen to learn, but there's a lot that, they'll bring up the climate change agenda, and cows are at the heart of that, and we must reduce our protein load. That argument aside, the argument that I've made is that, well, I'm here for human health, not for planetary health, and
Right.
sustainable regenerative farming is on the horizon.
Right.
Let's put all that aside and let's look at human health. And we've got to get people well now, rather than worry about what may occur in 200-300 years with regards to the climate. We've got a very, very sick population, and the health
Right.
of the planet, whilst it's important, it cannot come at a cost of a sick population. I think
Absolutely.
that point needs to be made. And we're very grateful for people like Gary Fettke, who struggled through what he struggled through, so that doctors such as us, can come out and practice with a little bit more confidence. And certainly this low carb movement, thanks to people like Paul Mason, Gary Fettke, all Australians, and I'm proud to say that I know those guys. And I work alongside Paul Mason in particular, work closely with him, and he's been instrumental in making low carb a thing here in Australia. So I think the literature kind of supports the way we practice. It is just getting the entire culture of this healthcare industry to change, and that will take years. It'll take possibly decades.
Yeah, I think it's moving in the right direction now. We were going the wrong direction for so long, and now at least we have a kind of a grassroots movement, and doctors and nurses and nutritionists who are starting to catch on. I think I've even heard in regards to since you brought it up, the health of the planet and the greenhouse gases. There's a greenhouse gas. We always hear about methane and cow farts, but yet, what no one's mentioning the nitrous oxide, which is runoff from all the nitrogen they're spraying on these monocrop fields that no longer have manure on them anymore, because they moved all the cows to one area and the corn to another, the fields to another, and you're growing the same. So there's no nitrogen. So you have to spray nitrogen on it. The runoff creates nitrous oxide. The heat retention from nitrous oxide is 5 times greater than methane. And there's really, it's like there's far more impact from nitrous oxide than from the methane. From cows, the methane from cows, the amount of or cows or humans or whoever's eating meat, but the nitrous oxide from these monocrops. So if, like you said, regenerative farming, if we can reintegrate animals with our fields and rotate crops and let the cows and the other animals and goats, sheep, who are ruminants, put the nutrients back into the soil, because they are carbon negative. They eat, but they put it right back. Then we have a solution for that. We have a solution for that source. It's not going to affect what comes out of factories and cars, but it certainly isn't going to make farming and a negative impact on our regenerative farm. There's regenerative farms just turned 50 miles from me that is carbon negative. I mean, they put it carbon positive. Excuse me, they put carbon back into the soil.
Yep, absolutely.
The way they do it.
I think a skilled farmer of the future is probably a tender for the planet's health. And I think not only that, they're producing hopefully quality protein that can sustain the planet. And I think we're really at a crossroads at the moment, and with regards to the planet and human health. And there has to be some major policy changes. But it's very, very difficult to do, Zane, when there's so much money mixed in with this industry, with the fast food industry, with the pharmaceutical, the healthcare industry. We need strong leaders moving forward. And where's that leadership going to come from? I'm not sure, because I have very little faith in these politicians, that are mixed in with these policies, because I don't think they've got a good understanding of everything that you've just described there.
No, no, because it's dogma. It's just dogma who can scream the loudest and who can make the biggest, grab the most attention in cameras. But it's a soundbite. The soundbite wins. You try to
Yes.
actually explain a process.
Yes.
People start,
Yeah.
they're glassing
Absolutely.
over, and the cameras are somewhere else. And what did he say? And they're over. It's like we've got too much. It's the dopamine that doesn't.
Yeah.
That doesn't stimulate dopamine. You got to have something in the news that stimulates dopamine, right? We're dopamine.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You want to hear about why one gas is more difficult, more impactful than the other, and it has nothing to do with a cow fart. It's the cow fart sounds much more of there's a villain, and
Yes.
those evil meat eaters, and and I am definitely a meat eater. You've got me beat though. I can't quite get protein levels quite as high as you. I got a little more fat than protein. So I'm looking at your kangaroo meat, and I'm like, that is the leanest looking stuff I've ever seen.
Yeah, but
Right,
you guys are pretty lucky up there. I mean, you get some good game meats in terms of elk and and buffalo and things like that. I'm presuming
you can get. Well, it's harder to get. I mean, I mean, you can pay for buffalo, but elk is. My dad used to hunt elk a little bit, but it's like you get one ticket a year, you get some elk, and you can't eat it all the time. I mean, it's rare. The deer is a little easier to get, but and there's some great farms. Grass-fed farming is on the rise. We have smaller farms and services that are just have grass-fed and pastured animals, and you get a variety of pork, chicken, beef, that kind of thing, like the regenerative farm I mentioned, 250. But it's in Georgia. It's not too far from me, and they have like 22 different animals you can get meat from, and it's all on a regenerative farm. So those kind of like individuals or individual farms, small farming, popping up, targeting their audience, and creating again a grassroots, so to speak, movement, grass-fed movement. I mean, it's great. It's great. It's becoming more affordable, and more accessible. So I think we've hammered fructose to ground. I like to try to end with action steps. It's like, what would you recommend a diet look like? Obviously not everyone's going to eat the same, but if we had a spectrum of what people should look for, what they start with on their plate, in terms of how much protein and then allowable fat and carbohydrate. I mean, that is, let's say not a carnivore, but someone who just wants to make a healthy improvement. Maybe whether they're struggling with metabolic disease of some form and want to lose some weight, or they're just doing a general, our typical low-fat, pyramid-driven diet. What would be some simple, if they're eyeballing their plate, what would that look like? What would be some simple changes they can make right out of the gate?
It's no problem to say, and I can answer that question. I mean, what I tell people, I don't think they necessarily need to fast, although it does improve things. I think generally longer people do a higher protein diet, they'll automatically drop down to 2 or 3 meals. I generally tell them as step one is they must stop snacking through the course of the day and aim for just 2 to 3 meals. If they're doing the meals, I say prioritize protein at every meal. The meal has to be about the protein. If you want to add something in, perhaps fibrous, non-starchy vegetables are a good way to go because they provide satiety, not just satiety. They've also got a very high thermic effect, so the body has to burn energy to utilize all that fibrous foods. So especially if their gut can tolerate it, some people don't tolerate a high fiber diet as well as others, but there are certain people that will tolerate it better. So to me, it's all about the protein, and you backfill whatever else is needed on the other end. So if in morning times, generally I encourage people to have things like eggs. I think eggs are a great way to make up your protein count, especially pasture-raised eggs if possible, as opposed to the eggs-fed diet very rich in corn and soy, because that increases their linoleic acid levels, which results in a high omega-6 count. And we can discuss that maybe at some other point as well, about the influence of what the animals eat. But eggs are a great way to go in the morning. I think for lunchtime, again, prioritize protein, whether that's meat, fish, or eggs. And at dinner time, it's the same thing. You kind of rinse and repeat. those three things and try and hit your protein target for the day. That depends on level of activity, age, and body weight. I think if people at the end of all of that still have a glycogen hunger or a energy hunger, I think they can, have some fruits at the end of the day and so forth. But generally what we find is when people are prioritizing protein at every meal, essentially there's so much satiety associated with that, they've got no space to fit it in. So
Right.
that's kind of the power of a high protein diet.
Well, hormonally, I think it would, like we've talked about the hormones before, it stimulates the hormones that, like you're going to stimulate, if you're eating high protein, you're going to stimulate the leptin and have that satiety. Yeah.
Absolutely. And at the end of all of that, you're in a calorie deficit. You prioritize protein at every meal. You completely stuffed yourself full of all this meat, fish, eggs, and fibrous vegetables, if you so desire, and you're still in a calorie deficit. And this is how people can lose weight and get all their essential vitamins, minerals, nutrients, amino acids. That's how you do it. Eating's pretty simple. It's about hitting all the essential nutrients that are needed. And at the core of it is the fact that a carbohydrate is a non-essential nutrient. And so
Exactly.
is fructose. So, and fiber. So this is why that concept of prioritizing protein at every meal is critical, and eating to satiety.
Absolutely. Eating to satiety, which we have been told not to do, right? We've been told to leave the table hungry for so long and then
That's
eat
right.
often.
Yeah, that's right. But unless there's satiety associated with a diet, there cannot be adherence. If there's no adherence, there's no long-term effect. So we need a diet that offers you 100% adherence or 90% adherence, which allows you to continue it long-term. And I term it an anti-diet because it's essentially a lifestyle change. Diet implies restriction. This is not restriction. It is simply satisfying, nourishing, and hopefully removes that hedonistic appeal associated with food. It should no longer be about the dopamine hit, but more about sustenance.
Absolutely. So when you say protein, just to clarify for people, we're talking about animal protein. That's all you mentioned. So like a 20 to 40 gram, 50 gram, maybe intake per meal is probably a good.
Yeah, I think so. I think 30 grams minimum.
Okay.
With that protein that's got a very high leucine content. Animal protein tends to have a very high leucine content, which will then stimulate muscle protein synthesis and has a whole host of other effects as well. Plant-based protein tends to be inferior in terms of its essential amino acid content. In addition, there's a lot of anti-nutrients locked in with that. It means that whilst there are amino acids in there, you simply can't access them as well as you can with animal-based protein, which we are far better adapted to absorb. So every meal has to be an opportunity to nourish yourself, maximally nourish yourself. Then why not do it with the most quality protein available?
Gotcha. So a minimum of 30 up to 50, depending on what you need, like you said, based on energy output, activity level, and size.
Absolutely.
But 30 minimum, 3 meals, you're looking at 90 grams of protein is kind of a minimum.
Yes.
Yeah, which a lot of people, like you mentioned, just say this for clarity, because you mentioned the United States, we're down to, for many people, an average 12% of their diet coming from protein. 90 grams is, that's to be a significant increase for them, for many of those people, if it's coming from a source, like, so not ancillary protein coming in from random beans or whatever, but coming in from their main animal source. 30 grams per meal, they are going to feel much more satisfied. They're going to feel full. They're going to know that they ate.
Yes.
And it's be much more likely, like you mentioned, for satiety to get to that next meal. So they only have 2 or 3 meals a day. And they'll notice their hunger actually diminishes. They'll, over time, they let their hormones calm down. Like you said, eliminate the snacking, which is probably one of the worst things we do to ourselves is that grazing and snacking.
Absolutely. It's a sign of not having enough nutrient density in the diet.
Mm-hmm. And a hormonal imbalance, or hormone doing that and triggering, so yeah, it's like a circle of just continuing. One triggers the other, and the cycle stays together. So thank you so much.
No problems, mate. No, it's been a pleasure chatting to you, Zane, again. And hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate your time. I know you're headed out of town with your family, so have a great time. I appreciate your time. I'm glad you thank your wife again for me for being gracious enough to share you as she's getting everything together to get out of town. So I know what that's like with a family. But thank you, Pran. I appreciate your time again. How could people find you on social media?
Generally, I'm on Instagram, Zane. I love that medium because it's a great way to visually sort of portray your ideas, and I'm a very visual person. So Instagram, it's under Dr. Pran. Yoganathan is my handle, and also on Facebook as well.
Right. Great. And I love sharing your stuff whether in the stories or just sharing it to my posts. It's always full of information that is not common. Not common. You have a unique bit of detail put in there many times, but the graphics definitely, you can tell you're a visual person. Your graphics are quite they're eye catching. They're very eye catching. So I appreciate them. They're unique. So thank you again.
Throwing a bit of humor in there as well with the memes,
right.
And it kind of got a good combination. I appreciate all your support.
Thank you. Thanks again for coming on, and have a great trip. And I'll make sure I'll tag your handles in the show notes so people can find you.
Thank you very much, Zane.